Chapter 23, the Digestive System, Part 2, your table of contents, and we are starting from pharynx. We did the oral cavity, here it is, nasal cavity is above it, that's your pharynx, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx. So those two parts, oropharynx and laryngopharynx, they allow passage of food, fluids, and air. And both of them are lined with stratified squamous epithelium. And surrounding that pharynx part, there are a lot of skeletal muscles, inner longitudinal, located like that, long muscles, and outer pharyngeal constrictor muscles. So they can constrict pharynx to push food down to esophagus. Let's see how it happens. But first, esophagus. So pharynx continues to esophagus, and it's a tube that connects pharynx to the stomach. As soon as it is going down and penetrates the diaphragm right here in this place, which is called esophageal hiatus, soon after that it enters the stomach. And right above that esophageal hiatus, there is lower esophageal sphincter that can close esophagus for a while. Next one, in the walls of esophagus, there are a lot of mucous glands, and the walls themselves are covered with stratified squamous epithelium. Those glands in submucosa produce a lot of mucus to aid in bolus movement. What is bolus? It's a lump of food that in the mouth was mixed with saliva. Changes that stratified squamous epithelium of esophagus, as soon as it enters the stomach, it becomes simple columnar epithelium. Digestive functions of the esophagus are summarized in table 23.5. Now let's talk about swallowing, or the correct name for it for our class will be deglutition. It involves our tongue, soft palate, pharynx, esophagus, and also 22 of different muscle groups. There are 3 phases of deglutition. The first one is voluntary phase, or it's also called buccal phase, and we can control it. Next one, pharyngeal and esophageal phases are involuntary, and the control centers for them are located in the medulla oblongata and lower part of the pons in the brain. So swallowing or deglutition starts right here from their first phase, when our tongue starts moving. That's food, bolus of food, down through the pharynx. And we can control the first stage. The second stage right here in the pharynx, it's when medial and inferior pharyngeal constrictor muscles start contracting and moving food down to esophagus. Finally, the third esophageal phase, we have no control over it also. It's when muscles of the esophagus contract one by one, step by step, and moving bolus of food down into the stomach, which is called peristalsis. And thanks to those muscles, the food can be moved into the stomach, even if we are in horizontal position when we are sleeping. Well, no, we are not swallowing when we're sleeping. When we're just laying down and try to swallow, the food still will go to the stomach because of peristalsis of esophageal muscles. Our next organ is stomach. So esophagus enters the stomach, and right here where it happens, that would be cardiac region of the stomach. Here it is, exactly the borders, the place where esophagus enters the stomach. So cardiac region surrounds the cardiac orifice or opening of the stomach for the esophagus. Then we have fundus, that would be this one, dome-shaped region. Most of the stomach would be body of the stomach, and that is mid portion where most of the digestion happens. Next one, right here we have pyloric region. Pyloric region is made of pyloric antrum right here. Then there is pyloric canal, the narrow part right here. That's antrum and that's pyloric canal. And finally, this one is pylorus, where the pyloric sphincter or pyloric valve is located. This valve usually is closed during digestion in the stomach, and only when food is completely, especially proteins, when they are completely digested in the stomach, pyloric sphincter opens and lets that food to go to the beginning of the small intestine, which is called duodenum. Okay, that would be lesser curvature of the stomach, and that would be greater curvature of the stomach. If you look at the stomach as it's sitting in the abdominal cavity, it will be right under the diaphragm, and it will be connected to the liver, starting from the lesser curvature through the structure called lesser omentum. What is lesser omentum? It's just a double membrane, mesentery, double peritoneal membrane with some blood vessels inside it and with some amount of fat. What about greater curvature? It gives rise to the greater omentum, or it's also called dorsal mesentery, hanging all the way down from the stomach. You can see it better in this picture. So that's the liver, that is the stomach. That small connection between liver and stomach would be a lesser omentum. That thing hanging down from the stomach, it's a double layer of the visceral peritoneum, which usually we call mesentery, and it's just hanging down and then goes back up to the transverse colon. That's greater omentum. Next one, nerve supply to the stomach. Stomach is regulated by autonomic nervous system. Remember, we have two parts, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic, it's our fight or flight response, and parasympathetic, rest and digest. So parasympathetic, through the vagus nerves, here they are, vagus nerves going to the stomach, activates digestion in the stomach, while sympathetic, going through those sympathetic trunks, and those would be splanchnic nerves. They actually slow down activity in the stomach. Blood supply through the stomach goes through the celiac trunk and mostly right here, left gastric artery. Stomach histology. What tissues are there in the stomach wall? As usual, there are 4 tunics like everywhere in the digestive tract, but muscularis externa will be different, because everywhere in the digestive tube you can find only 2 layers, longitudinal and circular. In the stomach there will be the 3rd layer, which is called oblique layer. That makes muscle of the stomach stronger, and that allows stomach to turn, mix, move, and pretty much physically break down food. Next one, mucosa of the stomach also is different. It's very thick. It's much thicker than in the other parts of the digestive system. And it's covered with simple columnar epithelium with a huge amount of mucous cells producing mucus. Why? So to cover the stomach wall with mucus and protect it against the stomach acid. There are a lot of openings going down like ducts, which are called gastric pits, and they lead on their bottoms to what we call gastric glands. Before you continue, please stop your video and answer the questions for chapter 23, part 2.1. Now about the structure of gastric glands. As I told you, right here at the very entrance to the stomach glands, which we call gastric pit, there will be mucous neck cells. They produce thin mucus. Then deeper, if we look in details into that part, you can see there are three types of cells there. The first type, deep violet cells, are called parietal cells. Then we have a lot of chief cells, and at the very bottom right here you can find what is called enteroendocrine cells. You need to know secretions of each type of glands. So those cells in gastric glands produce gastric juice. Usually most of gastric juice is produced in the fundus and body. Parietal cells, right here, parietal cells, produce two types of secretions. The first would be hydrochloric acid, or it's usually called gastric acid. It's a very strong acid. Its pH can vary from 1.5 to 3.5, and it can completely break a structure of protein in food, which is called denaturation. Another function of parietal cell produced hydrochloric acid is to activate pepsin. We'll talk about it a little bit later. Also, that strong acid can kill a lot of bacteria if we swallow them with food. Parietal cells also produce intrinsic factor, which is required for absorption of vitamin B12 in small intestine. If for some reason our stomach doesn't produce intrinsic factor, then we will be lacking vitamin B12. Deficiency of vitamin B12 can develop. Next one, chief cells produced substance called pepsinogen. Pepsinogen, as soon as it's produced by chief cells, will be activated by hydrochloric acid produced by parietal cells, and it turns into pepsin. And pepsin is an enzyme that breaks down proteins. Wait a moment. We just said that actually proteins are broken down by hydrochloric acid. That is correct. Large proteins are broken into small protein pieces by hydrochloric acid, but those small protein pieces still need to be broken into amino acids, and that would be work for pepsin. Finally, at the bottom of gastric glands, there will be enteroendocrine cells. And if all other cells, parietal, chief, mucous cells, produce their secret right here, and it goes through the ducts on the surface of the stomach, right here into the stomach, the enteroendocrine cells chemicals will be going down to the blood vessels. Blood vessels located in the lamina propria. So what exactly enteroendocrine cells produce? Hormones like somatostatin, which inhibits acid production. When stomach is empty, there is no need to make acid. And another hormone would be gastrin. When stomach is full, we need to stimulate acid production, and that would be work for gastrin. One more time, both somatostatin and gastrin are produced by enteroendocrine cells, and they do not go into the stomach. They go to the blood vessels in lamina propria, and through the blood they go to the stomach and regulate secretion of stomach acid. Okay, now I would ask you to stop for a moment. Remember what each type of gastric cells produces. If it's one, it means they produce just one substance. If two, it means they produce two substances. And try to fill in that table without looking back through the slides, through the video. Take your time. And we continue. Homeostatic imbalances. What many people have nowadays is called gastritis. That would be inflammation of the stomach lining, which is usually caused by anything that breaches the mucosal barrier. And in worst cases, it can turn into formation of ulcers, peptic ulcers or gastric ulcers, erosions of the stomach wall. Most of them are caused by Helicobacter pylori bacteria, and if they become deep enough without treatment, for example, they can go deeper and deeper, reach the blood vessels and cause bleeding. In the very worst cases, they can completely penetrate the stomach wall and make a hole in the stomach wall. It doesn't happen often. So that's how it looks right here. That would be an ulcer. And I will also put this link to the video right under the video, and please watch the animation about gastric ulcers. Digestive processes that are going on in the stomach would be physical digestion. Remember, when stomach walls contract, they mix food with stomach juices. Denaturation of proteins, which happens by hydrochloric acid. Enzymatic digestion of proteins by pepsin, or just breaking them into amino acids. Then secretion of intrinsic factor required for absorption of vitamin B12, and lack of vitamin B12 can cause anemia. It's called pernicious anemia. And also, finally, when food is digested, mostly proteins, stomach will contract and deliver that food with mixed stomach juice, right now it's called chyme, to the small intestine. How gastric secretion is regulated? Through the neural processes, and through the hormones. So, how our nervous system regulates gastric secretion? There are three phases. First is called cephalic or reflex phase. It starts several minutes before food even enters the stomach. It can even start before you start eating. Let's say you are very hungry. You see food, you smell food, you start salivating. At the same time, your stomach starts producing stomach juice. That is cephalic phase. Gastric phase. 3-4 hours after food enters the stomach produces a lot of stomach juice, hydrochloric acid, and digests that food. Finally, when that partially digested food goes from the stomach to the duodenum, it's intestinal phase. Right now, we need to slow down stomach. So that is inhibitory effect, or it's called enterogastric reflux. Next one would be chemical regulation of gastric secretion. There are 3 chemicals that stimulate parietal cells to produce hydrochloric acid. That would be acetylcholine, histamine, and gastrin. So again, what is gastrin? It's a hormone that stimulates secretion of gastric juice. So it happens when stomach is full. And gastric is secreted into the bloodstream by the stomach wall. Exactly, remember what cells produce it? Enteroendocrine cells. And that hormone is secreted into the bloodstream in response to the presence of food. Simply saying, you eat food, enteroendocrine cells produce gastrin. Gastrin through the blood goes back to the stomach and makes parietal cells to produce hydrochloric acid for digestion of that food. Why is that word right here, nicotine? It's because nicotine is one of the chemicals that we naturally do not have in our body, but when we consume it by smoking, it actually activates stomach to produce hydrochloric acid. So what happens when somebody smokes first time in the morning? When people wake up and they go and smoke, It means that their stomach will produce a lot of hydrochloric acid, stomach is empty, there is no food to digest, and that acid, earlier or later, if they keep doing it every day, will start hurting their stomach wall and can cause gastritis or even ulcers. So, even if people keep smoking, which is of course is a bad habit, the best way to do it, not on empty stomach. Eat first, then you can smoke if you choose so. Next one, gastric contractile activity. Peristaltic waves, contractions of the stomach waves of the stomach walls, move from their fundus to the pylorus approximately 3 times a minute. But when stomach is full and distension and also gastrin, they can increase the force of contraction. The strongest contractions will be near pylorus to move that chyme to the duodenum. Chyme is a food, half-digested food mixed with stomach juice. Usually it will be delivered to the duodenum in small portions, approximately 3 milliliters, or sometimes it will be forced back to the stomach, so stomach could continue digestion of that food for a while. How long food usually stays in the stomach, it depends on type of food, on its amount. If it's a very small amount of carbs, for example, it can leave stomach in 20 minutes because carbs are not digested in the stomach. If it's a good portion of steak, it can stay right there for hours. Before you continue, please stop the video and answer the questions for Chapter 23, Part 2.2. Now we are going to the small intestine. Small intestine right here is a major organ of digestion and absorption. Remember, digestion of carbs starts in the mouth, but it doesn't end there. Digestion of proteins starts and almost complete in the stomach, but not completed. It's not completed 100%. And digestion of fats starts and ends and finished, completed in the small intestine. Also, after all of those are digested, fats are broken into fatty acids, carbs are broken into simple sugars, proteins are broken into amino acids, they should be absorbed. It means through the walls of the small intestine, they should go to the blood. Small intestine usually between 2 to 4 meters long, is pretty long, and it starts from the pyloric sphincter right here, end of the stomach, to the ileocecal valve where it enters to the large intestine. There are 3 subdivisions to the small intestine. Duodenum right here, jejunum, and ileum. Jejunum and ileum are attached posteriorly by mesenteries, while duodenum is not surrounded by mesentery, it's retroperitoneal organ. Let's start from the first part, duodenum. It's pretty short part. Here's where it starts, from the stomach, and approximately in the center of it there is a tiny opening that is called major duodenal papilla. That major duodenal papilla opens of this bulb-like structure, which is called hepatopancreatic ampulla and hepatopancreatic sphincter. That ampulla actually joins together 2 ducts. The first one will be a common bile duct that brings bile from the liver and gallbladder, and bile would be for digestion of fats. The next duct, pancreatic duct, brings pancreatic enzymes for digestion of everything else, carbs, proteins, lipids together. So both of those ducts join together in the hepatopancreatic ampulla, and opening or closing of that sphincter and major duodenal papilla is controlled by sphincter, hepatopancreatic sphincter. Now we'll talk about histology of the small intestine. To increase the surface of the small intestine for digestion and absorption, especially absorption, there are circular folds inside of it, approximately 1 centimeter deep. Those structures that you can see in this picture, they are not circular folds. Look at a different picture. That is small intestine. That is a circular fold inside of the small intestine. You can see it without a microscope. Here they are, those folds. And on the top of those folds, there are finger-like projections called villi. That's plural. Each of them is about 1 millimeter high. They are very small. And a single would be villus. And they are covered with simple columnar absorptive cells. So that's simple columnar epithelium with cells that are called enterocytes. Also, there will be goblet cells there. Again, that is a fold. On the top of that fold, there will be villi. In the picture in your book, those structures, they are not folds. They are villi. So each of them is a villus. Villus is covered with that columnar epithelium. And on the top of each cell, that is one of those columnar cells, where there will be microvilli that increase absorption surface even more. All those microvilli together are called brush border. Those projections are of absorptive cells, and they hold brush border enzymes. Between those microvilli, there are pits, intestinal crypts, and inside of those intestinal crypts, there are 2 types of cells. Secretory cells that produce intestinal juice, which has a lot of digestive enzymes, and also enteroendocrine cells that produce some local hormones. Next one, submucosa right here. In submucosa, there will be pyrus patches, which are lymphatic structures, and they protect distal part of the small intestine against bacteria. Also, duodenal glands in the duodenum right here in intestinal crypts produce alkaline mucus. Question, why that mucus should be alkaline? Think about it. Think about what substance arrives from the stomach into the duodenum. That will be chyme, food, mixed with the stomach juice. And stomach juice is highly acidic. So, in the duodenum, we need some alkaline substance to neutralize acidity of the stomach juice. So, intestinal juice, that substance that exists in the small intestine, it's secreted in response to distension or irritation of the mucosa, which usually happens when half digested food, which we call chyme, arrives from the stomach. So it's slightly alkaline, and it's watery. It has some enzymes, but it's not very many enzymes right there, but it has a lot of mucus. And intestinal juice facilitates transport and absorption of nutrients in the small intestine. Digestion in the small intestine. That chyme that arrives from the stomach has partially digested carbs and mostly digested proteins, but not completely. And all the fats are still undigested. So, let's summarize. What happens in the small intestine? Small intestine finishes digestion of carbs and proteins, and all the digestion of the fats happens in the small intestine. There are 2 types of movements that happen in the small intestine, and first of them is segmentation. Segmentation, it's when contractions of the walls of the small intestine mixes and moves contents slowly and steadily towards the ileocecal valve, which is connection between small and large intestine. It's regulated by reflexes. So main function of segmentation is to mix food that hasn't been absorbed yet with digestive juices. When most part of the food is already absorbed, everything what we do not need and do not want to absorb, which would be meal remnants, tough fibers, bacteria, debris, everything else should be just moved to the large intestine for elimination later. And that movement will be called peristalsis. So contraction of the wall of the small intestine moves that part of unabsorbed food further. The next contraction keeps moving it along the small intestine until it enters large intestine. Before you continue, please stop the video and answer the questions for part 2.3. Large intestine. Large intestine starts right here where small intestine ends by ileocecal valve. So that valve, located right here, controls movement of food from small intestine into the large intestine. The very first portion of large intestine is called cecum. Pay attention that vermiform appendix is attached to the cecum, and inflammation of that appendix, it's what is called appendicitis. Then we have colon, a pretty large portion, the rectum and the anus. Colon is made of several parts. Ascending column goes up. Then next to the liver it turns and becomes transverse colon. That angle is called right colic flexure or right hepatic or simply hepatic flexure. Transverse colon then turns and goes down and becomes descending colon. That angle where it turns is called left colic flexure or splenic flexure. Finally, we have sigmoid colon. Structure of the large intestine. If you look from the outside, you'll find out that there are 3 bands of smooth muscle, which are called tinea coli or coli. Between them, there will be pouch-like structures called haustra. And finally, attached to those smooth muscles, tinea coli, there will be pretty small epiploic appendages, fat-filled sacs of visceral peritoneum. Their function is not known well. Histology of the large intestine. Inside, large intestine is lined with simple columnar epithelium. And there are glands right here, intestinal glands. They are not large comparing with stomach glands, for example, and they mostly have some enterocytes and goblet cells. Those goblet cells produce a lot of mucus that eases the movement of feces. Anus. Anal canal ends with anus. And it's the last segment of the large intestine, and right here there will be 2 types of sphincters. Internal anal sphincter is made of the smooth muscle, which is not under our voluntary control. External anal sphincter right here is made of skeletal muscle, which is under voluntary control. When human babies are born, they do not have control over their external anal sphincter. They usually learn it between age of 2–2.5. Now, functions of the large intestine. Absorption of some vitamins, some part of water, and electrolytes happens in the large intestine. Or sometimes it's not absorption, it's reabsorption of water. Like water is absorbed from the digestive juices. Major function of the large intestine is propulsion of feces towards the anus, and actually colon is not essential for life. If for some reason, like tumor, part of it has to be deleted, a person can survive without colon. Please remember to answer the questions for part 2.4.